In the years 1958 and 1960, two new Methodist churches were built in this district. For over 100 years, Methodists had worshipped in an old weatherboard building situated close to the corner of Myrtle and Clyde Streets. With the arrival of a new minister, Eric Grono, in 1956, it wasn't long before plans for a new Myrtleford church surfaced. At a cost of £30,000, construction began on a new church late in 1957. The old weatherboard church was moved further back on the block and became the church hall when the new building was opened in May of 1958. The foundation stone was unveiled by Mrs. Smith from Buffalo River, who was the oldest member of the congregation at that time. The keys of the building were handed to the Trust Secretary Jack Matthews by the architect Mr. Rawson, while the opening of the church doors saw the moderator of the church, the Reverend Dawes, officiate. A crowd of over 200 attended the opening on that day over 50 years ago. The old church was eventually demolished and a new hall built in latter days. Family christenings, marriages and funerals, as well as regular Sunday services, see the building well used to this day. The Reverend Eric Grono and his wife were paramount in the planning and building of this church back in 1958. This man brought his organisational skills to this town and left a fine legacy. The Myrtleford Show was first held in 1947 and has run on the last Saturday in October ever since. Its maintained attraction is a credit to the founding members of the organising committee, as well as those who give their time and effort to continue the tradition. The first moving pictures of the show, as it was, that survive, were shot in 1952 by John Robertson. These pictures are a nostalgic journey back in time for all who are old enough to remember, and for those who are much younger, a peep into the past. This old piece of film features the Miss Showgirl quest of the day, with the entrance riding a tractor and trailer into the limelight. The maypole was used as a feature of the show, with teams from all the schools, both Myrtleford and surrounding areas, providing dancers. The colourful materials wrapping around the pole to form a unique pattern. Just look at the huge crowd in attendance on the hill at the Recreation Reserve, packed with people for the one-day event. This is all we have of this very early show, but a brilliant record of show days gone by. During the 50s and 60s, aerial spraying of tobacco crops in the district reached a peak. The now controversial method of controlling pests on the crop was used extensively in this district up until the mid-1970s. Chemical companies and their local agents arranged for agricultural aircraft and pilots to carry out the spraying programs. In retrospect, much doubt as to health effects that came from the procedure lingers to this day, but back in 1959 it was all go, and the drone of aircraft motors could be heard up and down the valleys early morning and at dusk during the summer months. Pilots would land in paddocks where the aircraft would be filled with chemical, refuelled, and the pilot told where to drop his load. Tobacco workers acted as markers for the pilot, holding a flag on a long pole at the end of the rows so the aircraft could be guided along the right rows in the crop. The modified tiger moths that were used in the early days were pretty rough and ready, with several accidents over the years, mostly caused by the small aircraft hitting power lines. One accident at Yarrobin saw the aircraft completely destroyed by fire. Most of the pilots had lucky escapes, but one man lost his life in the early 1960s. The aerial spraying of tobacco is difficult, with small paddocks surrounded sometimes with large trees and power lines. It's a wonder there weren't more accidents in those days. After more than 2 decades of aerial spraying, the practice disappeared with the introduction of high-clearance tractors in the mid-1970s. But for those of us who can remember the small aircraft buzzing around, it was a colourful period in Myrtleford's history. The age-old practice of water divining was resurrected back in 1959. Myrtleford and most of the state was in the depth of severe drought. No rain had fallen for months and the situation was getting desperate. Diviners were hot property as the search for precious water reached top gear. Water divining dates back to biblical days when the prophets of old used the method to find underground water. The task is not for amateurs and a unique skill is required, as this so-called water diviner found out. After searching on Reform Hill for several hours and walking many kilometres in searing heat, he was left high and dry without even a slight movement from his crudely made divining rod. No water found was the call, so no wash for Ernie, the amateur water diviner. The first Tobacco and Hops Festival was held back in 1961, and just look at the palm trees are still in the centre of Clyde Street. They didn't come out until 1964. But this street procession in that first year was a colourful affair. Myrtleford had a town brass band in those days, and it's seen here marching at this first parade. The festival has continued right through to this day with very few changes, but basically the same format as on that March day in 1961 when it all began. After more than 100 years as part of the Bright Shire, the newly created Shire of Myrtleford was proclaimed in June of 1960. Constant lobbying over many years eventually yielded a government decision to annex Myrtleford from the existing Shire. Hundreds of residents crowded the area surrounding the Memorial Square to hear the then Minister for Local Government, Murray Porter, announce that Victoria had a new municipality. Elections had been held in May of 1960 and a 9-member council was elected with Ralph Selzer, the new Shire's first president. The Myrtleford Shire lasted only 34 years, when in 1994 this area was again amalgamated with the Upper Ovens and Kiwar valleys. It has been said that 100 years of development was carried out in the short time the Shire existed. Developments like sewerage, street paving and footpaths, together with the establishment of the timber mill, are amongst an impressive legacy. This film is the only movie recording known to exist of what was a most significant event in Myrtleford's history.